Hello, my lovely physiologists. I hope you have strapped in your seatbelts and you're ready to go. We are doing our first super big detailed physiological process here for our chapter 10. So stick with me, write down your questions and send them my way. So when we're talking about muscle fiber contraction, I think it might be helpful to give us four big, I'm going to call them, how about this? Umbrella steps. So four big umbrella steps to help us kind of guide ourselves. The first big step is that the brain, skeletal muscle contraction, is being controlled consciously for the most part. And so in the brain, we're going to see the brain is going to generate action potential, which is going to let's say travel on a motor neuron. The motor neuron we drew in our previous videos. So we had this idea of a neuron with its part of its body being in the central nervous system, and then its axon, or that extension, going out through the nerves. The second big step then is our action potential. I'm going to use the word jump because we have that synaptic cleft that we have to go over from the motor neuron to the skeletal muscle fiber. And this is happening at the NMJ. So we just had a video trying to help us visualize this particular location. NMJ stands for neuromuscular junction. So this is where that motor neuron synapses onto the skeletal muscle fiber. And when we're talking about fiber, we're talking about a skeletal muscle cell. The third big kind of umbrella step would be the action potential propagates, which is another way of saying travels, propagates across the sarcolemma. Remember, sarcolemma is our fancy word for our skeletal muscle cell membrane. And it's going to go into the cell, so into the middle of the cell via those structures we called T tubules, or we called it a transverse tubule. And then the last big thing is what we're going to call a cross bridge cycle. Last big thing we're going to call cross bridge cycle. So we're going to see, of course, that skeletal muscle contraction is under the control of the nervous system. So that's our starting point. Now, this information we're going to really be picking up pretty heavily in chapter 12. So we're going to get into this information in a little bit more detail in the future. And then we've already actually started looking at the steps at what's happening at the neuromuscular junction, but we're going to lay those out for you in a little bit more detail, hopefully. And then we're going to sort of pick up this information of how that action potential can propagate across the cell membrane, the sarcolemma, and then down into the cell via those T tubules. And then we're going to go into all the details, more than you want, of that cross bridge cycle. So that's what's coming up, and we'll try to break that up into a few videos just so we can take a little break. Popped ahead. Okay, so we've actually seen this picture before. This is our diagram from the OpenStax textbook. At the very top of the image, we're seeing, remember, our axon from our motor neuron, and we're seeing our enlarged end of that axon, that synaptic knob. And we're seeing our skeletal muscle fiber in that junction. So here, let's say this is like that first big step. Let's have our motor neuron, and the motor neuron, let's say, is housed in the central nervous system. That's going to make a little bit more sense as we move into chapter 12. Is going to generate the action potential. The action potential, remember, is like that electrical signal, right? The neuron signal. And we're going to say that that signal is going to reach the NMJ, which in your notes, maybe you want to write that fully out to be neuromuscular junction, right? So make sure that your notes are making sense to you. Now, when that action potential reaches the synaptic knob, so in the next picture, we're getting a close-up view of the neuromuscular junction. So we're seeing this enlarged part of the synaptic knob. We see those vesicles of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. We see the gap or space in between the two cells. We call that the synaptic cleft. We see the highly folded sarcolemma with those chemically gated sodium channels, and we call that particular area the motor end plate. Now notice in the diagram, you have this like red electric looking arrow coming in. So that's telling us that the action potential has reached the synaptic knob. So at the synaptic knob, the action potential is going to trigger. Now here I'm going to use my terms exocytosis. Exocytosis we talked about in chapter 3. So exocytosis is talking about the vesicle fusing with the cell membrane and releasing material. So here, if you want to, instead of saying exocytosis, say triggers the release, you can do that. So I'm going to say triggers the exocytosis of, and here I'm going to use my abbreviation, big A, big C, little h, which stands for acetylcholine. Acetylcholine, remember, is our neurotransmitter that we're talking about here. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers released at a synapse. So these are being released by a neuron, and it's signaling something to the next cell in the line here. So at the synaptic knob, the action potential is going to trigger the exocytosis of that acetylcholine. Now in our diagram, the acetylcholine is represented as those little red dots. So then we can say the acetylcholine is going to diffuse across the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft, remember, is that space. So the neuron and the muscle fiber are not touching. There's a little bit of space there. So the acetylcholine is going to diffuse across that space, across the synaptic cleft. And then in this next picture, we have an even more blown up view of this synapse. So again, we're seeing the synaptic knob, the enlarged end of the neuron. We see those vesicles full of acetylcholine. We see that some of those vesicles are in the process of releasing the acetylcholine. We see those red dots, that acetylcholine diffusing across the synaptic cleft. We see it binding to that protein channel. So next thing I'm going to say here is the acetylcholine binds to, and here I'm going to call it a chemically gated sodium channel. And just to make it easier in my notes, I'm going to abbreviate chemically gated as CG, and then I'm going to write sodium ion and channel. So remember here that a gated channel is one that can open and close. It's the binding here of the acetylcholine that opens. So that's why it's a chemically gated, because the chemical is acting like the key to open up the channel. And this is a channel that is specific for sodium, so only sodium ion is able to move through. Now we're going to call these in the future nicotinic receptors, so it's nice to kind of be able to recognize that in the future. So I'm going to put that in parentheses here. Now when that acetylcholine binds to the chemically gated sodium channel, then we see sodium enters the cell. And this is significant. So this is actually going to do what's called, I'm going to put this in red, deep, I'm going to make it a thicker line. This is going to depolarize the muscle fiber. Now we're going to talk about this term depolarize a little bit more in the future. But what we see here is that the movement of an ion is changing the charge of the cell. And because the sodium is a positively charged ion, because it's a cation, when it moves in, it's going to make the cell more positive. And so this is our electrical signal, right? This is our electrical signal. So the significance here of our acetylcholine is that it opens up these chemically gated sodium channels. Sodium is moving into the cell, depolarizing the muscle cell. That's going to directly lead us to our next step. So if we go back to our beginning sequence, we said that the brain generated the action potential and it traveled down the motor neuron. So we just kind of said that. We're going to pick up those details in chapter 12. And so you'll get more information on that in the future. We just outlined the big step 2. The action potential jumps from the motor neuron to the skeletal muscle fiber at the neuromuscular junction. So it's jumping because of that acetylcholine diffusing across the synaptic cleft. Okay, I'm going to stop there and pick up with the next step in the next video. So stay tuned. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.